The war rages on in Europe, Asia, and North America. People are fighting in many fronts and from many nations in this great second Weltkrieg that is ravaging the globe. There are many unique forces that inhabit this battlefront, and today we will be analyzing them all. So, the first faction that we will be covering in this Kaiserreich mod review for Arma 3 will, unsurprisingly to most of you, be the Germans. We'll start with their standard infantry and move on to some of their support infantry, and then on to their elite infantry, and I'll give you a couple reasons as for why things are the way they are, and I will do such for the following factions. So the first thing we'll focus on is our standard German infantry squad here. This is one where both the medic and engineer are included. There are versions of infantry squads with just riflemen and submachine gunners, with just a medic, just an engineer, or with both, and this is one with both because I want to show everything off. I also want to clarify real quick, I am running the immersive animations mod, I believe it is, or possibly immersive weapon animations. So things are meant to look a little more World War II-like as far as how they look, but it is a little buggy, so that's all I've got to say about that. On to the actual showcase. So, the first couple units we've got here are our German engineer and our German rifleman. Now you'll notice throughout this mod that most standard riflemen are equipped with bayonets. I figured this would be kind of a decent way to include them within a soldier's kit, and I also simply kind of like the way it looks. I also realize now that this is in fact not a rifleman, but a German medic. Medics are all equipped about the same across factions and will have some sort of indicator that they're a medic, though whether that ranges from an armband to a helmet to a backpack will depend on the faction. Here we have our engineer, which will carry usually satchel charges and anti-tank grenades. They can usually be identified by a neck scarf or something of that sort and gloves, as well as a large backpack. They'll usually carry an SMG, whereas their medic counterparts carry a rifle. This is done off the basic idea that the engineer has to get close to do his work, whereas the rifleman should probably, or not the rifleman, the medic, should probably be staying back with his injured comrades. Moving on, we have what looks like a standard submachine gunner here. Most squads will come with two of them, or possibly one depending on their composition, and they're a standard soldier plus SMG. Here we have our actual rifleman, and on this guy you can plainly notice the German cross placed here. I didn't want to go with the standard German World War II uniforms as they're so identifiable as being associated with the Nazi ideology that I wanted to stray from them in this case. Due to this, I gave them a rather generic gray uniform and found this arm symbol to represent them being all for the Kaiser. Of course, they're still using their Karabiner 98 Kurs. I'm sorry, my German pronunciation is terrible. I only speak Russian and English. Overall, he looks relatively normal. I'm very happy with how the German rifleman turned out. Next to that we have the machine gunner, which will in most cases be using the MG34. It's a slight difference, but I admit that during this I will go into probably more detail than you need, but I figure it's a nice place to get this information if you want it. I went with the MG34 instead of the 42 as, in my head, because keep in mind all of these are just based off my interpretation of equipment and appearances, Germany likely could have become slightly complacent with military technology during the era in which they had established their New World Order. Thus, most of them will be using MG34s over 42s and actually MP38s instead of 40s. Of course, the functional difference between the MP38 and 40 is minimal, but I do know the 38 to be a more expensive platform that the better off Kaiser's Germany could probably afford to produce, so they wouldn't need the 40 as much. That roughly summarizes our standard infantry for the German Empire. Now let's move on to the support troops, of which Germany actually has more than most other nations. The first one is the Mittel African Brigade. These guys are dressed in desert-colored uniforms and are, of course, African soldiers from the German colonies in the African continent. Who would have figured? These guys are equipped almost exactly the same as their standard German counterparts, but with tan uniforms and no emblem. Other than that, they are absolutely identical and will play exactly the same other than some slight cosmetic differences, and to be honest, I do quite like those colors of uniforms. This one also comes with a medic, and as will become standard for most support troops, they will come with a medic in every squad but never engineers. Our next squad is the Ukrainians. Rather than making Ukraine its own faction, I decided to make them a counterpart to Germany, though if it is demanded enough, I will make Ukraine separate. The Ukrainians have their own specific uniforms, which I repurposed to make look, well, Ukrainian. It has a blue and yellow stripe fitting the Ukrainian flag, at least in reality, and I figured that these were nice uniforms to be able to work for them. Their medic is slightly different from the standard German, as he also has a dedicated helmet for himself, as well as the tornister backpack. The Ukrainians, of course, function being a regular support troop as any other one does, but I figured they're a nice addition on top of the German soldiers, and would make sense as the one to add, as the Ukrainians make up the largest portion of Germany's puppets' armies, if I'm not mistaken. Finally, we'll move on to our elite German troops, which consist of the Kaiser Guard. The Kaiser Guard all run this camouflage and are very well equipped with STG-44s, Gewehr 43s, and even have a sniper with the Kar 98 Sniper Edition. They of course have a medic as well, and their squad leader can be differentiated by his hat. Quite like how these guys turned out, and their full body camouflage is honestly quite appealing to the eye in my opinion. I decided to place them next to one of their panzers as well. So that about summarizes the German Empire. So our next faction is the Union of Britain, and I took inspiration from their uniforms from an interesting place, that being original Soviet gear from World War II, except I went with the color scheme that looked the most like reality's British forces, and then combined it with British kit like their helmets and rifles, and made somewhat syndicalist/communist looking British soldiers. I'm quite proud of this thought, even if it's just, ooh, Soviet plus Brit equals Soviet Brit. But anyway, the rifleman, as one might expect, uses the Lee Enfield rifle. Their submachine gunners use the Mark II Sten, unlike the Dominion of Canada, who uses the Mark V Sten. And of course the Bren gun. All in all, a pretty standard loadout for the regular troops. Not too much out of the ordinary, but with a different and kind of cool look to them. The next one is the International Brigade. These guys are meant to be from all over the world who are volunteers to go and fight for syndicalism, marked with their green berets in the soldiers and the red ones from the squad leader, and this guy is quite reclining right now. And they effectively are the same as the others, but with a more green uniform, green berets, and a separate look. They also have a wider selection of face selections, so they will often be from a wide variety of places. And the final group of our Union of Britain is the RED Red Commandos, who are equipped with Mark III paratrooper helmets and denizen helmets. These guys have some pretty decent camouflage, and most of them run Sterling SMGs, making them a very effective close quarters elite force. This will make them suffer at range, but with their decent camouflage and foliage-covered helmets in some cases, they should be capable of being a quite effective force for sneaking up on the enemy. Alright, the next faction we will be covering is Boris Savinkov's Russian state. First, to clarify, I went with Savinkov's Russian state as they seem to be one that appears a lot, as the AI chooses them relatively frequently, and also because, well, anytime they're around a whole lot of wars happen, so I figured that fit for Arma 3. Though I'm not opposed to making other ideologies of Russia, since they can go a multitude of ways. So anyway, let's get on to it. So for starters, the engineer is using probably expectedly a Papa Shah, has his scar rolled up, and he has a satchel bag to carry his explosives in. The medic goes with a different variety of showing his status with a medical bag. And we can also see here the specific patch linked to Russian state infantry, including the downwards to the right sword, which fits the Savankovist flag, as does this wreath around it. I chose that patch because, well, it just kind of fits the flag, while also being different enough to signify maybe it just being a military symbol. Next we have here our standard submachine gunner with his Papa Shah, what looks like the other submachine gunner, and then on to some of our riflemen using the revered Mosin Nagant. I gave most of these guys their full pack worth of equipment because I just simply thought that it looked better to have them carrying the entire group of equipment with them. Aside from that, we've got several riflemen, the machine gunner with some leather gloves and his DP-28 dinner plate LMG, and a unique unit type for the Russians that I did forget to mention with the Germans, which is the elite rifleman. Both the Russians and the Germans have one, which is effectively a rifleman who uses a semi-automatic rifle. With the Germans, it is the Gewehr rifles, and with the Soviets, it is the SVT-40 rifle. Elite riflemen will usually be the corporal and will take command if the squad leader, whom we can see here, is killed in combat. So that is effectively the Russian standard infantry squad. If we go over here, we should be able to meet their very near counterpart, the Central Asian squad, equipped with the same color uniform, but a different emblem meant to be slightly different to differentiate where they come from. The Central Asian squad is identical to the standard Russian infantry squad, except, of course, they are meant to be hailed from the Central Asian areas that Russia usually conquers every single game. So here we have our Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks, and I figured I wanted to represent them within the mod, but I also figured they wouldn't be that much different from your standard infantry, so here they are. Next we have one of my favorite additions with one of its members, one of the Central Asian members standing guard here, looking pretty nice with his DP-28. But we have the Cossacks. Of course, the Cossacks make up an integral part of the Russian state, so I gave them their own squad. They have a panther emblem to represent them, and of course they all wear their traditional Cossack hats. These, I think, are quite the nice detail. They're dressed in those smooth black uniforms, and honestly I think they're a nice bit of flavor for the Russian state, and it makes sense that they'd have their own distinct uniforms. Other than that, of course, identical to standard infantry squads. Finally, we'll move on to our Russian Special Forces, which I may have made a controversial decision with, but hopefully you guys will enjoy it, and keep in mind I did it for a reason. This is the Nacgvardia. The Nacgvardia, unlike the Kaiser Guard, do not really wear camouflage, but they do have early ballistic vests in the form of the same turtle shell armor that Soviet shock troops wore in our timeline. This, of course, makes these Russian state guys somewhat easy to spot, but incredibly strong in face-to-face combat. So maybe not as covertly powerful, but in a direct battle, probably the best unit in the game. Of course, as we can see with our man right here, they are wielding a certain iconic weapon, and keep in mind it is for good reason. I, for starters, gave them only the standard AKS, which, if you don't know, is not the AKM, which is the standard AK seen most often in media. This is the heavy, hard-to-produce variant with the metal underfolding stock I went with because it's likely cheaper than the full wood one, just to represent the fact that they're still gotta make some sacrifices to use this. The reason I went with this is because in Kaiserreich proper, the final rifle for the Russians is the AS-42. Of course, no parallel exists to this within Arma 3 or any of the mods I used, So I went with the AK, thinking that it's more interesting than simply copying the STG-44, and also because it's an assault rifle like the AS-42 pictured in the mod itself of Kaiserreich and Hoi 4 is. That, and it's just kind of a fun little thing that could make this mod and this unit very different from the rest. Of course, the rest of it is relatively to be expected, with the squad leader wearing the dark gray helmet, and the units themselves having an eagle with a sword. Of course, sword iconography is very present throughout this mod. So, that is the Russian state. Alright, next we're going to be covering the American factions, starting first with the Federalist Americans. These guys are one of my personal favorites in terms of appearance, as they wear these pretty slick looking hats in place of helmets, because when you're fighting for the American Caesar, I guess head protection is no longer a priority. So anyway, they have a couple things that make them unique, which is, for one, they are still the only faction to get a semi-automatic rifle as their standard weapon. This is, however, the reason that I didn't give any of them helmets. I just wanted at least a slight balance, so at least if you set off a grenade near one and it goes next to their noggin, it's still gonna kill them, even if they do have the semi-auto rifle. Though, of course, after doing some M1 Garand testing in-game, I have found that due to its recoil, it's really not that much faster at standard engagement distance than a bolt-action rifle, so hopefully it shouldn't be that much of an issue. Of course, next to this we have some of our standard riflemen, and they have alternating cap colors, somewhere brown, somewhere this tan. Most of them wear this tan. And the standard rifleman just looks really nice in my opinion, using the classic Garand. Then we've got our MG, who is using a kind of cut down M1919. It doesn't have a stock or a bipod, another thing I chose to balance out the whole M1 Garand thing, making it a very uncontrollable but very powerful machine gun. And in the right hands, it probably can be used to decent effect. And it does come with this cool chest holster here. Of course, we also have our medic somewhere around here. Here he is. He's the first of many that will be wearing the gilet, whatever it was from the Geist mod, which has this medical symbol and obviously shows that this guy has treated a person or two because he's seen a thing or two. And he has the lightest color shirt to kind of fit with his gilet, and well, I think it's kind of obvious that he's the medic. He is also armed with an M1 carbine, as it's a lighter rifle, giving him more ability to carry medical supplies. Next, of course, is our engineer, and Federalist factions will be armed with the grease gun. I'm going to make a quick note here that I did what I could to make sure every American faction had its own unique weapons and that they weren't all using Garands and Tommy guns. So, the Federalists get the grease gun. This guy also looks pretty cool in my opinion, especially with the way that his magazine holders go. But he's otherwise got a pretty similar loadout to other engineers. Standard submachine gunners also get the grease gun, and our squad leaders a little bit less formal, just having the wool hat and an M1 carbine. This will make him a little easy to differentiate from others. But, well, he's a squad leader, he's a sergeant, and especially in the Federalist military, he's probably seen some stuff, so I don't think he cares too much. Now to move on to our next unit type, which is kind of like the Central Asian Brigade of Russia, which only has a pretty slight cosmetic difference, and that is the African American squads. Now, I didn't want to ignore the likely reality of this America, so I decided that even though it is not really okay to separate people like this, I figured it was realistic to have the squads separate like this. So this is how they are. They are, of course, equipped and uniformed exactly the same as the other counterparts that they have over there, and are overall just a way to include African Americans in the conflict, especially since they aren't actually included in the Iron Front mod that this is based on at all, and I figured, well, we should put them in. So next after that is the Marines. I decided to give the Federalists the Marines just out of Marine culture, and also because Marines are a, we'll say, representative element of the American military, one could say. So it fits the American group that is most similar to, well, the American military. They have this very nice marine camouflage from the Pacific, and to be honest, these are, I've said it several times, but these are some of my favorite looking guys in the game. They actually have their squad leader equipped with the trench shotgun for close quarters situations, and they have the full M1919 with stock and bipod included, so it should be a little more usable. Though their standard riflemen are still equipped with the M1 Garand. And they of course have their sniper and medic. Definitely one of my favorites. When I play this mod, I'll be doing plenty of marine action. Alright, the next faction we will be going over is the American Union State, led by the Long Dong Huey Long, and they've got a gray theme for infantry, somewhat similar but distinct from the German Empire. They're, I think, the first faction that I actually made for the mod, and they have this kind of unique symbol, which is some US state's flag, I don't know which one. But I figured, especially with the eagle like that and the uniqueness as opposed to the standard US flag, I figured especially in the gray tone it kind of fit what's on the American Union States flag, so I think it works. They have a bit of an interesting weapon combination using the Lee Enfield, which I just simply chose for a couple reasons. One is a slightly historical interesting thing, which is that I'm relatively certain the Confederate forces in the Civil War used Enfield muskets, and also just to differentiate them from the others. I acknowledge that the American Union State is not equivalent to the Confederates, but that's my head justification for it. Other than that, they use M50 Rising SMGs, which, while expensive and impractical in real life, are pretty interesting and cool, so I figured I'd give it to these guys. And if I can find our machine gunner, they use the Bar machine gun, which I'm sure some of you were waiting to see. And other than that, pretty much all their weapons are either 10 or 20 round capacity, but they're all pretty capable, so definitely a fun faction to play, I would say. The next faction we are going to go over is the Minutemen. These guys are also modeled after Hussard Corps' art, in which they just have plain gray uniforms with not much headgear. But they do have this unique symbol, which doesn't really mean anything, but it does distinguish them from the soldiers. And I like in particular their squad leader fitting them with the gray beret, running the Lee Enfield and such. Despite how plain he looks, I quite like their squad leader. But the regular soldiers are all equipped about the same, no headgear and a rifle, this time the 1903 Springfield, equivalent to what the standard soldiers of the combined syndicates use, and all in all, a somewhat uniform but still not completely effective militia unit. The next one that comes about, where are they, is the Silver Legion. While I would hope nobody particularly wants to play as the Silver Legion, they are here just simply because they are a part of the lore, and if I want to authentically represent the scenario, they should probably be here, and hey, they'll probably make good targets to shoot at if you're playing as one of the other factions. Our final thing to look at for the American Union State is the Bushwhackers. These guys look pretty nice in my opinion, kind of taking a bit of an airborne aesthetic, but also with some foliage and some nice green uniforms. And I decided to make these guys kind of modeled after the idea of, you know, the kind of people who've been out in the woods, they know their way around the wilderness, they can go on long operations, and they are armed with the M14 rifle, simply because it's an evolution of the M1 Garand. It's an interesting rifle, and it kind of fits with the addition of the Kalashnikov and the FAL in other factions, as well as making them a unique and, in my opinion, quite fun unit to play. They almost look like early Vietnam-era soldiers. And voila, American Union State. Alright, now on to the Combined Syndicates of America, the Syndicalist American faction. These guys have some nice, smooth green uniforms to oppose with the American Union State's gray, and they have these icons to, well, showcase their syndicalistness as well as these Red Star, technically Soviet helmets, but I do think they quite fit them due to, well, said Red Star. I also think they're equipped quite interestingly, with the Springfield 1903 being their standard weapon of choice, and having the Tommy gun as their submachine gun. This is chosen for a reason that'll probably make a good amount of sense, which is just because, you know, this contains New York, Chicago, all those upper cities with the mafias, you know, using the Tommy gun, so of course they have it. And overall, it is going to serve them well, I would assume. And then we have our elite riflemen, actually, that they have, which has the M1 carbine. I gave them an elite rifleman because the 1903 Springfield is probably the worst bolt-action rifle out of what's in the mod. So to slightly compensate, I gave them a guy with the M1 carbine, as it is a semi-automatic weapon with a 15-round capacity. Next, of course, we have our machine gunner, and he has the full variety of the M1919 just to make it a little different from the Federalists, and they also get the slightly better version as another way to make up for the Federalists having the Garand. A lot of choices I made in equipping the American factions was done for balance's sake, and this is one of them. Then finally, we have our squad leader once again running a Thompson and slightly stealing a Soviet hat, but with that still olive color and the red star to fit the theme of syndicalism. Overall, I think these guys are a pretty good looking standard infantry. Next, we have one of the more unique support units, and this is the Workers' Militia. Workers' Militia are effectively, and don't worry about the invisible mag thing, I'll fix that, are a militia unit, as one may expect, that all wear pilotkas, which are just basically caps with the red star of syndicalism, that are equipped almost entirely like civilians. They actually run old surplus Mosin-Nagants, which I chose to slightly differentiate them from their counterparts in the standard army, but also for an actual historical reason, which is that in the real World War I, America produced a lot of Mosin-Nagants to help support the Russians. Since those Mosin-Nagants, due to the fact that the Americans never entered the war, probably never actually maybe left America, we'll just say that they ended up with these guys. But they do get to keep that nice 1928 Tommy gun as their SMG. However, they don't have a machine gunner and they don't have a medic due to them being a militia unit. Though, due to the fact they're dressed like civilians, you can, if you wish, pull some suspicious tactics with them if you wish. Though the officer is from the regular military, so he will probably stand out a little more. Next, we have the elite units of the combined syndicates, and that is the Red Guard. I almost forgot the name for a second. These guys have these nice red bandanas and some more red star helmets. However, they all have hollow red stars, just as a little bit of differentiation. They run tan uniforms and full assault vests, and most of them wield what we would call in our timeline the FNFAL. In this mod, I consider the FAL to have been developed earlier on by the Commonwealth remainder countries, Canada and Australia, in the early 40s. This, I decided, just would make them a little more unique, and due to the proximity of the combined syndicates and the fact that they're near enough to someplace like Canada that there could be defectors to their ideology, I decided why not? We can make these guys interesting by giving them these weapons. And this also is another way, the main reason that I did this, to balance out the terrible rifle that the standard infantry has, by giving their elites a very good one. The machine gunner remains the same, and the squad leader runs an M2 carbine, the fully automatic variant. Alright, next we have the Australasian Confederation, and these guys are probably one of my personal favorites in terms of overall faction appearance. A lot of their guys run a mix of their helmets and these hats, which especially with the folded brim variety look pretty cool. These guys are equipped by and large pretty similarly to the Canadians, as they are allies, with the distinct difference of having the Owen gun. The Owen gun is, in my opinion, a much more interesting weapon than the Sten, but they do perform about the same. I also do like the way their uniforms look, pretty nice color there, and pretty multi-use as well. It fits pretty well with a wide variety of environments. Other than that, as you can see, due to the fact that most of them wear hats, to some extent, they didn't spend as much time making their helmets super foliage and camouflaged out, instead focused on some pretty nice fashion. Next squad we have is the Papuan Riflemen. These guys, like the Central Asians, you know, African Americans, yada yada yada, are another group within, equipped similarly, but these guys actually have different uniforms. These guys wear SEAC uniforms, and I decided to give them to these guys just because they're a nice looking uniform set, a little different from the others, and I figured I'd give them a bit of a purpose. Other than that, these guys wear a slightly lower percentage of helmets than the standard Australasian troops, but are otherwise identical. Probably slightly better suited for a jungle environment, I'd say, just due to the color of the uniforms. Finally, coming the elite of the Australasian, some really nice looking guys as far as appearances go, the Australasian Digger Commandos, of course using the word digger as a reference to their title in World War I, that the Australians in particular got, the Diggers. I decided that'd be a kind of cool title, and I did actually give them all entrenching tools. These guys are not particularly heavily armored, but they'd fit well in a desert environment, have the FALs, and overall just look pretty badass. I mean, look at them. Running those Enfields and those hats. I'm sure just the pure cool factor of the curved hats, or even the beret of the squad leader, could probably kill any Syndicalist forces within a mile radius. Alright, the next faction we will be covering is the Ottoman Empire. These guys are of course making an appearance within the mod as a somewhat counterpart faction to Germany, but as their own independent thing with some unique equipment. For one thing, their weapons will be slightly inferior to the Germans, as they've always been a little economically behind the powers of Europe, but they are still a very formidable force to fight. They have these nice brown uniforms which can work in either a desert or even a forest environment, and are equipped with short carbines of the Mauser patterns. This means that they're probably not quite as good at long-range engagements, but the optics are very nice and the weapons are very light for mid to close range engagements, and it makes them a very good standard infantry for particularly taking cities. They are of course still armed with something like the MG-34, and they all have a little patch with their flag on it. They also have, if I can find one, the MP-38s like the Germans do, and their medics wear the full cap helmets, making them a little more obvious a target than their German counterparts, but no less helpful. Their engineers in particular look pretty nice with the color scheme, with the full head wrap, the netted helmet, and the large backpack, and they are equipped quite well, as I'm sure you would have guessed by now. Their squad leader also takes a bit of a different approach to his uniform, actually having a camouflaged helmet rather than just a cap, making him theoretically a little more capable of surviving your average engagement than the standard squad leader, while also having a relatively unique looking camo for his helmet. Other than that, a pretty standard and flexible infantry unit. Now their support unit is the Nomad Squad. These guys are meant to represent something like the Bedouin nomads around North Africa, or possibly some people on the Arabian Peninsula. Generally just meant to represent some of the more tribal elements of the Ottoman Empire's territory, while still being a very formidable military force. These guys are definitely best utilized on a desert map with their tan uniforms, and have some interesting headgear, including red for the medic, which makes him both an easy target, but also easy to identify if you need to get him over somewhere to treat your injured, while also making him arguably one of the best looking of the nomads. Submachine gunners, of course, equipped about the same, with the riflemen taking some darker head dressings, helmet, and the officer taking a full black one as well as a neck scarf. This makes him probably one of the hardest to distinguish officers, so he hopefully won't be as big a target as usual. Though I guess the binoculars do give him away. Now over to our elite Ottoman troops we have over here. We have the Sultan's Guard. These guys are actually equipped in some pretty nice full camouflage, and they run, I believe, Gewehr 41s, unlike the Kaiser Guard who run Gewehr 43s. So they're a little behind, but really only in reload times. They're actually in most combat going to be an incredibly viable unit to use, and they have very nice camo which can blend into a variety of environments, as well as just overall, they look pretty sick, you gotta admit. However, their squad leader, as I believe this to be, is equipped with a Gewehr 43, which is likely lent to him by the Germans. He is also pretty hard to distinguish from the standard riflemen, so once again, following the nomad pattern of not being that big a target, which is honestly probably a good thing. Alright, one of the last factions, not the last, but one of the last factions we'll be covering today is the Dominion of Canada, which is quite the interesting faction in my opinion, as they're equipped somewhat similarly to how we view Britain to be equipped in World War II. This is another one where I took a little bit of inspiration from what I saw from Hussard Corps' art, and most of their riflemen actually have camouflaged helmets. They can't afford some of the more technical advances in technology, but with something like a little bit of foliage on their helmets to help them blend in a bit, they put the extra bit of effort in there. Their standard riflemen are equipped with SMLEs from World War I. This is chosen more so to differentiate them from other factions in the game, and also because Canada is not exactly the greatest industrial power of the world, so it does somewhat make sense that they would not exactly have the resources to have the most modern rifles, especially since a lot of their rifles in reality were provided by Britain, which, you know, oopsie, they gone communist, so can't exactly rely on them for weapons anymore. However, they decided to, as we'll see as a theme between the Canadian and Australian units as opposed to their British counterparts, is they'll take British things and change them. So one of those examples is the Sten gun, which I decided to give the Canadians the better Sten gun. It's still a Sten gun, so it's still pretty cheap, but they've got the one with the nice wood stock and the foregrip and the actually existing iron sights. This will hopefully make this SMG guy a little more fun to use than at least the British one, though they do still use the standard Bren gun. It's probably the most common MG in this mod. Their engineer also runs the Sten gun with his trademark at this point, Scarf, and all that. And of course we have our standard unit types, you know, engineer, medic, rifleman, officer, and all that. The officer being the one with the woolen cap, and of course, you know, the sergeant indicator. The next unit we have is one that's quite interesting, I believe. It is the British Expatriate Infantry. These guys are meant to represent British guys who left Britain and went to Canada at the end of the First World War, or current refugees from Britain, who decided to return to Canada and join the army so they can help fight to reclaim the homeland. These guys fittingly all use the British English voice lines rather than the North American ones that the Canadians do, and they all have these green berets with the royal crown on it, which I figured fits their loyalty to the British crown. Other than that, they're equipped the same and look about the same, with their squad leader running a red beret. Overall, I think these guys were a kind of nice inclusion to have, and definitely one that I think helps to make Canada a unique faction to play. Their elites, on the other hand, are the Royal Paratroopers, running some nice camo and some nice helmets and some nice rifles. In this universe, I decided to give the Canadians and the Australasians the FAL, as the FAL is a rifle that, especially with taking a little bit of creative liberty, could be a weapon that probably could have been invented in World War II or around there, if the effort had been made to put it into service. And of course, as this is a world with heightened tensions around this area, and I'm of course looking to make sure that factions have interesting weapons, voila! The Canadians have an FAL, and it makes these guys one of the stronger of the special infantry. And I can imagine I'll be doing many paradrops with them in the future, dropping down on Syndicalist forces and fighting to restore the crown. Now the next faction we're going to cover is the Qing Chinese forces. These represent, of course, the Qing dynasty in the Kaiserreich universe, and I equipped them as they are often shown to be in the art with this bluish uniform. This is, ironically, a uniform type gotten from the other side of the world, Finland. However, I thought that these uniforms actually fit very well to make these guys look quite unique overall. They are equipped with full-on Carabiner 98 Kurzes, however the late version with the hooded sight, unlike the Germans, but ultimately the same rifle overall is what the Germans are equipped with, meaning they have a very reliable bolt-action primary rifle. Of course, their medic, as we can see here, easy to identify, but honestly looking kind of fresh with them uniforms. And then we have our officer with a cap, unlike most officer caps, but a cap nonetheless. And he, like his submachine gunner compatriots, used the K50 SMG, which in reality is a Chinese copy of the Papasha SMG invented after World War II. But due to reasons mentioned prior, and to give China a unique SMG, as a lot of the decisions made are simply to make factions unique and interesting even when it doesn't always make sense, they have the K50. It only comes with stick mags, but it is a very high rate of fire, very effective SMG for close quarters combat. We of course have their engineer with the gloves and the mask. He is, as any standard engineer is, overall quite a good addition to any squad. Next, if I can find him, we have our LMG, our machine gunner, running a Bren gun. This was a difficult decision to make on exactly what the Qing Chinese should use as an LMG, but I ended up going with the Bren gun over anything else, as in reality, China was in a similar situation to where it is now, where Germany has some relatively okay relations with them, so I figured their equipment could be similar-ish, and since the Bren platform and weapons like it were so common, and the Chinese in real life used a lot of these, I just decided it would be a good balance of something they could use. That about covers their standard infantry squad. The only other guy that we didn't look at was this rifleman who wandered off over here. The next guys we have are probably my favorite support troop in the game, and they are the Warlord Infantry. Warlord Infantry is infantry that is gotten from the local warlords and hired out to the Qing dynasty. These guys are, as you'll see, battle-hardened, battle-weary veteran soldiers who, despite not having quite the same quality of equipment as their main soldier brothers, are a force to be reckoned with. Most of them, as you can see, are wearing plain caps for headgear, so most of them are lacking helmets, but a lot of them, as you'll notice, are actually combat injured. This was a detail I decided to include, as warlord soldiers likely get involved in skirmishes all the time, and also wouldn't really have a chain of logistics to kind of help them out after a battle so much. So a lot of wounded soldiers are likely left to just kind of have to deal with their wounds and continue fighting, since they have no formal chain of logistics, and they'd probably be fighting all the time. However, their corporal can be identified in a somewhat funny way, I'd almost say, as the corporal, if I can find him around here, is always going to be the one who is injured effectively the most. Usually a corporal will spawn with both a head injury and a leg injury, signifying that he's seen some stuff, basically. But other than that, the squad leader's not actually so distinct. Next comes the elite forces of the Qing dynasty, and that is, as is becoming the theme for monarchical factions, the Emperor's Guard. These guys don't have too much in the way of camouflage, but they're interesting in that their rifle of choice is the M1A1 carbine, which they have copied from the US. I went with the A1 because, well, metal folding stock is probably easier to produce than the full wood one, and to make it distinct from the ones used by the Americans. Thus, here they are, equipped with camouflaged helmets, pretty decent rifles, though mostly meant for close range. And another thing that they've got a copy of, the bar. I would argue it's probably actually less effective than the Bren that most of them have, but it is what they have, as it was another machine gun used in reality by the Chinese, and I figured this would be an interesting way to implement it. Of course, the squad leader has an actual Gewehr 41, meaning he's probably the best armed out of them, but he's also not too distinct from the others, so he shouldn't be able to be picked out that easily. Alright, our next faction is Japan, a faction formatted somewhat similarly to their equivalent in the Faces of War mod, but one that I made myself simply to fit the format of my mod's squads, but also for another reason that I'll get into in a minute. So, first thing we have is our standard Japanese infantry squad, equipped as one would probably expect a standard infantry squad of Japan to be, with our medic being kind of hard to distinguish, only having the tornister backpack and a cap, but the standard Type 99 Arisaka rifle, our SMG soldiers with his Type 100, as one may come to expect now, and of course standard rifleman with the Type 99. We also have our machine gunner with, well, another Type 99, but this time the Type 99 LMG and a Nambu pistol, and then our officer sitting here in the bush with his cap and Type 100. The engineers look almost a little goofy here, with this giant box being the equipment in which he carries his stuff, but the Japanese didn't really have a larger backpack, and based on what I know about the industrial capabilities of Japan, a box may be about all that they could spare the resources for, since they spent so much on their navy. But hey, he carries the same equipment, he's about as effective as any other one, so it's just a bit of a cosmetic oddity. Next we have their neighbors over here, the Korean infantry. Once again, I decided to include these for the same reason that I included the African Americans for the Federalists or the Central Asians for the Russians. They're another group distinct from the main nation's army that would have fought and I thought needed some representation. So I decided to differentiate them as Korean by giving them all these short-sleeved uniforms as well. We know the Japanese didn't really treat the Koreans all that well, so I guess in this that translates to giving them short sleeves, so they don't have long sleeves to avoid pesky mosquito bites, I guess. Well, that, and also a lot of them don't have helmets anymore, but other than that, functionally identical to the Japanese, and there's a little bit of a funny thing, I guess we'll say, which is because Japan is a faction I specifically made to exist on both Green 4 and Red 4, just due to the oddities of which factions they may fight or may not fight. You can actually, if you so chose, do, say, a Korean uprising with Korean soldiers on one side and Japanese on the other trying to put down an uprising. Just an idea that I thought of while preparing to make this video. That is a thing you could do, and it could actually be a fun thing, so there's a suggestion for something to try out. Next we have our elites, which is of course the Special Naval Landing Force, otherwise known as the SNLF. These guys have some foliage backpacks, though are probably the only special forces to not have a semi-automatic or submachine gun as their weapon, but instead a bolt-action rifle, meaning their standard infantry is probably the worst elite special force, but there wasn't any semi-automatic rifle I could give the Japanese that would particularly make sense, though I am considering, because in reality the Japanese attempted to adopt a copy of the Garand, I'm considering that for these guys, but I'm not sure if I will do it. Of course, the machine gunners are to be seen with the Type 99 still, and several of these guys will actually have the iconic Japanese headband, which, despite being kind of impractical, is something that I would probably use just for cool factor. Of course, we have what looks to be our squad leader here with his cap and Type 100, and our sniper in full foliage helmets. Now, while I would say these guys are probably the worst equipped special forces, they are probably the best camouflage, what with their foliage equipment and really nice color for the uniforms, making them probably a good covert operations unit, putting them at the opposite end of the spectrum as, say, the Russians, who are probably best suited for frontline combat. Well, next we have the Commune of France. These guys are somewhat inspired by the real French army, but also have some of their own little differences. A lot of their weapons do come from unsung and not Iron Front, so I figured I would state that outright. Let's go ahead and start out with their standard rifleman, which runs the Moss 36 rifle, which is actually a rifle with quite nice iron sights. They're of course still using the Adrian helmet that they have had for pretty much the entire early 20th century, and are using this specific patch, which I thought was kind of a nice little touch, with the yellow somewhat complementing the tan and a red star in it, as a slightly subtler reminder than, say, the combined Syndicates that, hey, we're Syndicalists. So we've got that guy with the Moss 36, pretty much a standard-ish French type loadout, but we also have our machine gunner running the Bren. Now, in none of the mods that I decided to use for this was there any sort of actual French machine gun. I decided to go with the Bren, especially because of the Commune of France's close relationship with the British. It's, of course, well, a Bren gun. I'm sure you know how it works. We've also got our squad leader equipped with a red beret, bet you can guess why it's red, and a Moz 49 SMG. This SMG did not exist at the time, but considering that the mentality that I used making this is that the world was slightly more militarized overall, due to a lot of non-democratic / slightly collapsing nations and overall just higher tensions, I decided that some slightly more advanced military tech could fit. Thus, Mach 29, with both the squad leader and, of course, our submachine gunners. Our medic also uses the gilet, like the Federalists do, which clearly marks him as, you guessed it, a medic. And he also has the medical satchel. Our sergeant here comes with the telltale sign of an engineer, the neck covering, and the large backpack, which I do believe I made a different shade to the others just for a little bit of differentiation. Of course, he's also got nice gloves. The next ones we have are the French Commune reservists. These guys are actually based on art from a Reddit user called u/Hussard Core, who has made a lot of amazing art that has given me good inspiration for some of these units, so credit to him for at least inspiring the way that these guys look. Where I went with these guys having these pretty simple white tops and some berets. They are of course not equipped with full military gear, hence the lack of helmets, but they are equipped pretty similarly to the standard military, especially given that the syndicalist ideology is not super hierarchical, so these guys could probably get their hands on some nice military gear. Though of course the officer, just cause had to do it, is wearing that classic French, I don't know what it's called, but that hat. Other than that, a relatively standard infantry squad with a very nice cosmetic appearance. Finally, we come to the elites of the French Commune, the Garde Rouge. These guys are equipped very well with Moz 49 semi-automatic rifles, used for the same reason that the Mach 49 is, and some darker uniforms that should have a better time blending in to forest environments. These guys are generally equipped pretty similarly to their standard counterparts, with the main difference being this better semi-automatic rifle, and in my opinion better looking and more practical uniforms. Overall, a very reliable infantry squad, and one that actually is one of the very few to have a semi-automatic sniper rifle. Alright, and the last faction we will be covering today is the Kingdom of Poland, which actually has a bit more of an interesting weapon roster than you may expect. So to start off with, they have these nice brown uniforms and the Polish flag wrapping around their helmet with the eagle in the middle. Now, I had an interesting decision over whether or not I'd have them using Kar 98s or Mosin Nagants as a main rifle, but I ended up going with Mosin Nagants for two reasons. For one thing, I find that a lot of factions already use the Kar 98 or a derivative of it, and especially if I do some more Central European factions, that's only going to be more that use it. So I decided to go with the Mosin Nagant for uniqueness, but I also went with it because, logically speaking, it's likely that after the Russian Empire was pushed out of that area, a bunch of Mosins were left in Poland, and they might have decided to adopt those instead of the K98. I don't remember exactly what they're using in the Kaiserreich mod. It is likely the Kar 98. So this is probably slightly inauthentic, but for gameplay's sake, I decided to go with the Mosin. But you can swap it out for the Kar 98 if you wish. Their SMG is a bit of a wild card. It's somewhat based on the unit icon for it, but it's the kind of strange Papasha / MP40 combination. Looks like a Papasha shoots the 9x19 of a MP40, and I found it in the mod, found there's no reason for me to give it to anybody else other than the Polish, who are stuck in between the Russians and the Germans, so hey, they have their own unique SMG that I'm pretty sure no one else will ever have. And for the LMG, I went with the same uniqueness factor, and that is using the DT machine gun, which is likely their own derivative of the DP28 in universe. Once again, could have given the MG38, but that's another one that a bunch of other factions are going to use, so once again, uniqueness factor, especially because Poland is kind of a out-of-the-way faction in Kaiserreich. I figured I could get away with a bit more creative liberty on them. Though if enough people demand it, I will consider changing it to something a little more lore-friendly. Anyway, next we have the reserves. The reserves are not equipped with formal unit army uniforms, but they all are quite exceptionally Polish, considering some of them have the flag 3 times on them, and they come in a nice variety of uniform colors, using some standard equipment that we've seen plenty of times before, but some nice appearances. These guys in particular, with the green hats, green uniform, and the black pants, is probably my favorite of the reserves. And they might actually be pretty fun to do some behind the lines against an invading force type deal missions. Probably my favorite of the informal support troop classes, we'll call them. Finally, the elite troops of the Polish, the Royal Hussars, where I went back to a bit of a lore-friendly approach, where if these guys really got some high-end stuff, it was probably going to come from Germany, and thus they are running STG-44s, Gewehrs. Still the same LMG here though, but their own kind of unique look with some red scarves and tan uniforms. Overall, a pretty nice looking elite unit, if I do say so myself. And with them, that will conclude our faction showcase. I know it was long, hopefully you skipped around to whatever you cared about, but I do hope I covered any questions there might have been about the mod, and if there are any other factions you want me to add or general suggestions for it, please put those in the comments below. I will be 100% sure to read as many as I can. Until then, consider checking out some of my other content on the channel, or maybe even subscribing. And if you decide to do so, I'll see you in the next video. Das Vidania.